Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green.
And I'm your presenter, Paul Sheriff.
And we are continuing on in our series on building apps using XAML and .NET MAUI. And we've spent a number of episodes working with the UI. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit and kind of look at maybe a more advanced topic for the next couple episodes. And specifically today, we're going to investigate the MVVM design pattern, what that is, how you do it, why you should do it, and we'll get started with that.
All right. Well, great. So what I thought, kind of a good thing, I don't do this very often. I really like staying in demos, but I am going to do a little bit of slides here. So model, view, view model. All right. So it's all about just really good end-tier architecture design. It's breaking things up so that each thing is responsible for each thing. So like we're going to isolate the database code from the UI. The user interface and your code behind, you shouldn't be calling the database directly, for example. You know, the model is like our data class. That's our entity class, if you will, like our user class that we just wrote. Okay? We have our view model, which is just another class. But this is where we use the properties of it to bind up to the UI. So we're going to probably create an instance of our user object in this other class, this view model class, and then we'll bind that to the UI. Okay. And then anything else we need, like one of the things you talked about earlier, you know, is like this is checked or is enabled or something like that. Would we use a property maybe in the view model to turn things off and on? Yes, that would be a great use of a view model, is to have all those is checked, is enabled, is visible, things like that. So the idea is that the view model, his job is to use the database code and these models, the entity classes, to create what this thing is going to look like on the screen, right? Or not what it's looked like on the screen, what the data is going to be that's put on the screen. Right. And the view model then exposes these services or properties so that the view then, which is the user interface portion, can simply read that data from the view model. So pretty simple. Okay.
So the view doesn't understand the data, doesn't need to understand the data. Right. The view just says to the view model, go get me some data. Yep. View model goes and gets data, passes it off to the user interface. View model doesn't care what's going on in the UI. Not my job. Right. My job is to just go get data.
Yeah, exactly. And then just like that, the model doesn't know anything about the view, right? Yeah. The entity class doesn't care how it's displayed. Is it displayed on MVC or on a WPF app or a WinForms app or just sent over an API? It doesn't care. It doesn't know. Right. So, and then the model really doesn't even know anything about the view model. Yep. The view model will create an instance of the model, but again, it has no effect on the model at all. The model is simply data. That's all it is. Right. And then the view model really doesn't even know anything about the view. Okay, I try to keep all of my UI logic out of my view model. Now, there's one case where you might want to use some UI stuff in the view model, and I'll show you a way around that using inheritance, so we don't have to have our view model polluted by UI code. And I'll talk about that one in a coming up episode.
So one of the beautiful things about this is the reusability. So I have had an app that I'd written in Xamarin, and then I wanted to rewrite it in MAUI, and I 100% literally reused the view model and the model and just added them to the project and then wrote an entirely new user interface.
You got it.
And I didn't have to change any of that code. So that's a giant chunk of work that was 100% reusable because it's exactly the same stuff.
You got it. In fact, that's my next slide. Thank you. But all communication from the view to the view model is done through data binding, okay? As much as you can. Now, obviously, there might be cases where you still need a little bit of code behind, but you want to try to make as most of it as you can through the view model. So the data for the list view, the collection views, whatever we need for list of data, the is-enabled properties for buttons, the text properties for entry and editors and things like that. All of that should be done through data binding as much as possible.
Cool.
And as you just said, by separating all this out and having each one of these in their own separate class libraries, we can easily reuse our view model, our repository classes, regardless of the technology that we're using to present the data to the user. So WPF, Blazor, .NET MAUI, Web API, MVC, even WinForms, if you want to go back that far. You can write the view model, the model, and the business logic one time, and then it just works everywhere.
Cool.
So obviously, why do we do this? Well, as we just said, reusing these views and models and everything from one UI to another. So Windows Forms, WPF, .NET MAUI, Web Forms, MVC, Web API, Blazor, blah, 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 whatever Microsoft comes up with in the future. In fact, I have view models and assemblies that I wrote literally 20 years ago that still work today because I designed them this way. Right? So it doesn't matter what Microsoft comes up with as far as the UI part. My classes, the data, the view, the data itself, that doesn't change, right? No. Also, makes unit testing a lot easier because now you can just unit test your view models, your views, your view models, your models, and your repositories. Okay, really easy to do unit testing on those. So, and then we're writing very little code in our text-specific classes like the content page, right? That code behind. We write as little as we can in the text-specific UI or the MVC web API or whatever. All right.
Cool.
So
I'm sold. How do you do it?
I know, exactly. How do we do this stuff? So glad you asked. So let's go ahead and add one more base class. And we'll call this one View Model Base, because I'm going to create, right? So what I'm doing here is for each type of set of classes that I'm going to have, entity classes, view model classes, repositories, doesn't matter. I want to have a base class that I can always inherit from. But each of these is also then going to inherit from that common base, so they each have access to that property changed event. All right. So then let's go ahead and right mouse click, add a new project, another class library coming at you. And this one will be our AdventureWorks.ViewModel layer. So I had the entity layer. Now we're building the view model layer. And again, like we did before, we'll delete the class one. We'll right mouse click and we will add a new folder called View Model Classes. Okay, and then into this one, we're going to add a class called User View Model. And so pretty standard design pattern. I think you're kind of seeing the pattern that I'm doing here. So let's go ahead now and
the beautiful thing of putting that in a separate class library is it makes it much easier to reuse it in a different UI project.
You got it.
Instead of adding view models folder to the MAUI project and then basically copying and pasting, reusing those classes the next time you do it. You just make a class library out of it and then set a reference to that.
That's it.
All right, that's cool.
All right, so obviously, since this new view model layer project we created, we obviously have to set our references to our entity layer and to our common library in order to get everything to work. And then we can look at this code here. So this is a view model class, and this is a typical one where I inherit from a view model base. I'm going to create an instance of my user object. So I'm going to have a private variable and then the public property. And look at this. I'm even raising the property changed on that user object. So once we have those two in place, now I have a get, which we'll look at in a minute here, but I have this get where I pass in an ID and I want to return a single user object. Okay. So I'm just going to use some mock data. So I'm doing kind of, boy, doesn't that remind you of exactly what we did in the XAML here?
Yes.
Look at that. See, so we're basically saying, well, now let's go ahead and create this in code and we'll set all the properties here, set it up, and we'll return this user object. Okay, and then I've got a save down here. I've got the break so we can watch that happen as well. So what do we need to do? Well, let's go back now to our MAUI application, right mouse click, and let's add a reference now to our view model layer. So that's the first step. And if you remember in here, I had created this XML namespace that pointed at the entity layer. What I want to do now is change that so it now goes against, easier if you just back this up a little, let it redo it. So AdventureWorks.ViewModel layer, that's located in the assembly, AdventureWorks.ViewModel layer.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now the data type is changing from user to user view model, right? Because that's what's in this AdventureWorks view model layer is our user view model. And then I no longer need this guy, okay? Mm-hmm. I don't need any of this because I'm not going to be, using that at this point. So we're going to remove that. I'm also going to remove the binding context from here because I got rid of that as well. I got rid of that view model. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just do a build here. Make sure I did everything correctly up to this point. Okay. So oops, I think I forgot to close that last.
Okay, that would explain the squiggles.
I know, the squiggles, they just drive you crazy. It's like, what did I miss? Okay, There we go. Now we're successful. All right. Now, going back here on this view model class, I have a public property called user object, don't I? Mm-hmm. So when I'm binding, see, the bindings are now complaining at me because it's saying, well, wait a minute, this login ID is not there. But if I do user object, oops, let me go here. There we go, dot login ID.
Okay.
Okay, because now I've kind of pushed that entity down one layer, and I'm saying, well, I've got this wrapper class around that guy, the wrapper class being my view model. Okay, so on all of these bindings, I just need to change it. Pretty simple. All right, now obviously you would start out this way. I did it because I was building it up little by little, but obviously you would do it the right way and just do it this way from the get-go. So, try to get them all here. That's it. Excellent. Okay, so let's try a build here again. And one of the things I mentioned, I think, gosh, one of the very first episodes, I talked about that binding window, that binding failures window. Mm-hmm. So if you had missed one, that's where it would show up, is you would see the binding that is wrong. And that's kind of a nice window. Remember, that was under debug windows, and we're not seeing it because we're in build mode right now, but you would see that binding failures window. So something pretty nice to take a look at. So it looks like everything's good here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back now to here, because if you remember, we've changed our view model now, right? Our view model really isn't coming from here anymore. What I want to do is actually create it as part of my user view model. So this will be the binding. And I'm going to go ahead and change this. I don't like using user object. I want to keep it a little bit more generic and just simply call it view model. All right. Now, inside of the on appearing is where I can now write a little bit of code too. And this is just for right now. I'm going to show you a better way to do this, but I want to kind of at least bring you along very slowly. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new instance of this user view model. We'll then set, look at this, I'm setting the binding context on the whole page. And Robert, you had asked, right, can we do that binding context on the content page? Well, that's exactly what we're doing. We're just now doing it in code, aren't we?
Okay.
So I'm binding that up, and then I'm calling that method that we wrote that says, okay, yeah, pass in an ID and we'll build this user object, which then sets the property user object, which we are then using to bind to each one of these.
Right.
So if I've done everything correctly, we go ahead and run this, and we should see everything works exactly the same as it did before, but we have new data because now it's getting that data from the view model class. So let's bring this guy up. Go into users, navigate to the detail, and there we go. Okay. So now this is a very simple example of a view model, but you can see all we've done is we've kind of abstracted things away a little bit, right? We've just kind of pushed it down, and that way I can add methods now into the view model to actually get data. And I can get a single piece of data. I could get a list of users. So the view model is going to give me some services that I can then call from the code behind to say, hey, let's go ahead and initialize this guy, right? And I'm going to show you how to even cut this code down a little bit as well. So coming up in the next episode.
So let's review. Show me again the ViewModel base.
So the ViewModel base doesn't have anything in it now, but I want you to think, right? We need to think and extract a little bit that for this application, I may have 20 view models. They're all going to inherit from this. And maybe there's something in common that I do on every single page. I only have to now add it in one place.
Okay. Because and then the view model is all the code to work with the model and get the data.
Correct.
Yep.
And that's where you would add maybe some business rules in here as well, right? Okay.
And that's where the raised property changed is.
The raised property change, if you remember, is view model base inherits from common base.
Common base. Okay.
So everything goes to common base. That is the absolute base class.
Okay.
And that's good. No, it's a good review because remember, entity base then is for all my entity classes because I may have users, products, objects, customers, address, all of that. They're all going to inherit from entity base. So if I need something in common across all of them, let me ask you this on a database. Don't you typically add to every single table who inserted it, the date they inserted it, the user, the time somebody changed it, and the date and time on every single table? Don't you typically do that?
Yeah, sure.
When you need properties then across all your entity classes for each one of those, well, instead of putting it in every single entity class, you can just put it into the entity base, can't you?
Yes, right.
And that's the reason why we create these base classes this way. It gives us flexibility to add things on a little bit later.
Cool. Love it.
All right.
Very good overview and introduction to MVVM. We'll be expanding upon that a little bit more in the next few episodes.
Yep.
But for now, good place to pause. And what are we going to look at next?
So next, we're going to kind of expand on that with dependency injection.
Cool.
Those two kind of go hand in hand, and we'll talk about dependency injection and how that works in MAUI.
All right. So stick around for that, and we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.